Awesome. So I'm Will. I'm from the fellowship team. Most of you know me already. David, would you like to introduce yourself?
Hello, I'm David Lord. I'm a core maintainer with the Pallets projects, which are a collection of web and other Python libraries for making applications. So the most famous one is Flask, but we've also got Jinja, Click, Werkzeug, It's Dangerous, and Markup Safe. And those are the 6 projects that I'm working with MLH on, but I'm also a maintainer of a bunch of other libraries too. I'm also an organizer of San Diego Python. So if you're ever in San Diego and want to come to a cool Python meetup, ping me.
Awesome. Well, thank you, David, so much for joining us. I really do appreciate it. So just to start things off, some people here aren't familiar with Python. I'm a big Python fan, but some people have been working on stuff like Next.js and Julia and React and stuff. So for those who aren't familiar with Python as such, could you just give a quick rundown of maybe what like some of the what Pallets is and why you would use Pallets, for example, different parts of it?
Okay, I thought you were going to ask me to explain Python for a second.
No.
Oh, God, that's a big topic. Pallets is a collection of libraries. It's just an open source organization. You would use different libraries to build different types of applications, or Flask, which is a web application framework, wraps up all 5 of the other libraries to one degree or another to do different parts. So Flask is a kind of full-featured web application framework, but it's called a micro framework, which distinguishes it from other types of frameworks that kind of go for a batteries included approach, like Django, where there's a lot of things provided for you in specific ways. So Flask tries to be more hands-off in terms of letting you make your own decisions. But it's very fast to set up an application in Flask, especially for things like APIs, where you want to serve some data really quickly. But you can make any type of application with it.
Awesome.
Do you want me to go? I'll go over the 2 other main libraries, which are Jinja and Click, really quick. So Jinja is a templating library, which means you write a template with special placeholders for logic like for loops and placeholders to render information. And then Jinja, you can pull in those templates and render them with by passing variables to them, and it'll produce some sort of text document. It's used in Flask to produce HTML usually, and it's very fast compared to a lot of other templating engines, although probably some have caught up by now, because it actually behind the scenes compiles to Python code to render. And then Click, kind of like Flask is for web applications, Click is for command line applications. So it kind of provides a sort of familiar API, but to create commands and options and arguments on the command line.
Awesome. Well, that sounds really good. There you go, everyone. You just had your crash course on Pallets. Now you'll be professional developers. Awesome. So we've had about 15 or 20 questions from the fellows over the last few days. So starting things off, Tamor has asked, how do you resolve conflicts where different people have different ideas as to which direction the project should go in? For example, pull requests, which are incompatible with each other, for example.
Let's see. There's kind of a couple answers to this. The first is it just doesn't happen much, at least for our projects. We actually get compared to other libraries that are as popular as us, I think we get a fairly low amount of traffic in terms of issues reported and people working on issues at the same time, which is good and bad in a way. I wish we had more maintainers and stuff, but so I haven't really seen anybody work on the same issue and then happen to submit 2 different PRs more than a couple times in the 5 years I've been maintaining. But when that does happen, I'll usually I do some work anyway to kind of clean up a PR before I merge it. So I might combine ideas, or just kind of base my decision on what PR looks better to me. Sometimes one will have tests and the other won't, and it's an easy decision. In terms of like determining the direction or like a design decision, I wasn't the original author of any of these libraries. I came in later. The original author, Armin, kind of stepped back from the project, so he's still like the original author. He's still associated with the projects, but I'm pretty much the one in charge of making decisions nowadays. But a lot of those decisions were already made. Basically, there's a philosophy behind the libraries already, and the libraries have been around for a decade now, so they're pretty stable.
Awesome.
Yeah.
That's really interesting. I imagine that some people on the bigger projects will definitely have those sort of issues. But as you said, more maintainers for Pallets, maybe some of the fellows, if you're looking for something to do in your spare time after the fellowship.
Yeah, absolutely. One of the things I'm like slowly working on that I need to finish is like a guide for how to maintain projects. Because there's a lot of stuff behind the scenes that you don't get when you're just contributing. So hopefully I can write that up.
Oh, brilliant. I think the fellows would definitely really appreciate that, as some people here are new to open source and not really sure how to get started. So having some kind of a experienced maintainer show people how to get started would be really, really helpful. Awesome. So our next question is, it's quite an interesting one actually, is how do you get paid to work on open source full time? I'm wondering if you have any sponsors, for example. Are you paid to do open source, or?
It's complicated. I have a regular full-time job, and part of that job over time I have evolved it into being able to work on the Pallets projects during work hours, because basically that work supports all the projects that I started that use Flask and the other libraries. So if I'm developing Flask, I'm helping those projects and any other projects that use it in the future. So I've kind of made a case over time in my specific job to work on that stuff, but I'm not explicitly paid to work on open source. In terms of sponsors, we don't have any sponsors, I'd say. I have done a lot of work while establishing the Pallets organization. We're part of the PSF, which is the Python Software Foundation, which is a nonprofit organization in the United States. And so we take donations through them. And so people donate fairly regularly. We get a little bit of money for that. We also have a partnership with Read the Docs. So advertising, half of the advertising revenue goes to us, which is pretty awesome. And then we're also part of a service called Tidelift, which kind of goes out and does the work of convincing companies to pay for open source for us, and then aggregates those subscriptions and distributes them out to different projects. And I don't really get paid from that fund at all. We're looking into how to set that up for some maintainers, but we're mostly saving up to that money to do a conference in the future.
Oh, awesome. Have you got any more information that you can share about this conference that you're potentially going to do?
Well, I was planning to organize one this year, but other things happened. So a Pallets Conference is hopefully going to happen next year or within the next 2 years. I would really love it to. But kind of independent of me, some community members around the world at different Python groups have organized a Flask Con, which is coming up in, I think, the first weekend of July. I'd have to look up the exact date, but it's flaskcon.com. And I'm one of the reviewers for talk proposals. So we're reviewing talks right now, and we're going to send out acceptance messages tomorrow, which is pretty exciting.
Awesome. I'm going to check that in the Google Meet chat. So if anyone's interested, as this will be running in just a few weeks.
And it's completely free. So it's all streamed online. We're still working out the exact schedule, but it's also going to be recorded and go up on YouTube. So yeah,
Perfect.
check it out.
Well, and if any of you are actually part of the pod contributing to Pallets, then this is something that you'll probably find quite interesting. Put a link in the chat so you can visit that a little bit later. Wonderful. So our next question, taking a slightly different turn, they ask, in my experience, design patterns are probably the most intriguing things in software development. How does one go about gaining an expertise in them? These are quite deep questions, aren't they?
Yes. Design patterns. I think the last time I consciously thought about design patterns, well, was probably in college, which was a long time ago. And they definitely, like, it helps to understand them, but I don't think I really think about them that much day to day. And that might also come from, like I said, like Flask and all the other libraries were already basically designed and set up. Like the API and the layout of the code was fully realized by the time I stepped in. I would say like the way that I like became familiar with how to write Python better and stuff, though, without like explicitly learning about patterns, is just looked at code that was successful in other projects and tried to like copy that. So if I saw like, oh, this is a cool thing, how did they implement this? Oh, they're using some sort of object that collects attributes and does this. Then I kind of built on that.
Ah, awesome.
Hopefully that answers.
Yeah. If the person who asked that question is here, do let us know in the chat if that makes sense, or if you want any got any follow-up questions. Cool. So Ayush asked a question about saying that he has good knowledge of JavaScript and software development, and they started machine learning through online courses and pursued it for a year until they couldn't find an internship. They switched back to web, and they are unable to decide between web and machine learning. Machine learning seems interesting, but the maths behind it bores him. And I want to develop real software with machine learning, but I was also worried about landing a job. What career path do you suggest?
Oh gosh, well, I don't know if I'm qualified to answer that one.
Machine learning and web development are quite different topics.
I have very little experience with machine learning. For my day-to-day job, we do a lot of processing data, presenting it to users, kind of aggregating it into reports and that sort of stuff. But we never really have used machine learning at all for any of that. So all the sorts of data analysis I've done has been pretty basic in comparison. I know plenty of people who do machine learning and love it too. So what career path do you suggest?
I mean, if you love one or the other, go for the one that you love. I'm sure
if you found that you don't like machine learning, don't do machine learning. You can be successful doing pretty much anything. There are people out there who need that service, and if you're good at it and you like it, I think that'll come through.
And the other thing is, just because you did machine learning for a bit doesn't mean you have to do it for your entire life. You know, you can switch it up a bit. So maybe you do machine learning for a few years and then you switch to web development. You know, you're not limited. You'll be learning like similar skills between the two by doing either one. So I would say, following on what you said, is pick which one you find the most exciting. I'm not sure how helpful that is because it sounds like you find both of them exciting, but hopefully that helps. Wonderful. So our next question is from Kaful. What are some soft skills you wish you were better at when you started out at your career, and how would you improve them? I feel like soft skills are underrated.
Like, I have to think about these for a little bit. So one of the things I've improved a lot, I've worked at the same job for 9 years now, so right out of college. So I've had a lot of time to kind of find my place in the company and also like improve myself. One of the things I've become a lot better at is kind of communicating with clients, communicating in a way that's like productive to the entire endeavor, while still figuring out, all the intricacies of something. That sounds like a really simple thing, but it can be hard sometimes to like talk to a client who doesn't really know what they want yet, or what they're asking for compared to what's feasibly possible in the 6 months they're giving you. So figuring out how to talk to them, find their requirements, and all that. I'd say in terms of what I've learned with open source, though, it's kind of similar, I guess, but figuring out how to communicate with people who are opening issues on your projects. You don't want to just close everything, even if you might know you're not going to work on something, but you don't want to just like close it outright. You need to you want people to still be interested in submitting issues to you and contributing when they can. So knowing how to point people in the right direction to use better resources, if they have a question, it's not an issue, or explaining why we're making a decision. So yeah, communication, I'd say, is just the thing I've improved the most.
Awesome. I totally agree. Communication is very underrated in tech. And sometimes over communicating doesn't hurt. Don't be afraid to say too much. I definitely find doing a lot of different things that if you just say the same thing again and again and again, people will eventually realize that you said that thing. Wonderful.
I guess I'll say one more. And this is kind of with open source, but kind of with everything I've done. So like contributing to open source, writing answers on Stack Overflow, writing stuff for my job, but writing technical documentation, or like technical writing. So like explaining something technical clearly so other people understand it. I think I especially associate this with like answering questions on Stack Overflow, but being able to not just answer a question, but explain, like give people enough information to understand why the answer is the answer.
Yeah. No, that's really, really helpful. I definitely know from my experience with Stack Overflow I get the answer, but if the answer for whatever reason doesn't work for me, I then don't really know where to go from there. So no, it's very helpful. So
yeah, you can kind of see that in my progression over the 10 years I've been on Stack Overflow. It's like you look at my really early answers and they're a lot more simple than the later ones. Later ones have all sorts of links and paragraphs that have nothing to do with the code.
Take note, everyone. Add as much information as you can. Wonderful. So our next question is from Ryan. Ryan says, there are many times, both in open source and in your career, where you need to learn a completely new code base as efficiently as possible. In your experience, what are some proven hacks you've used to get up to date on what's happening within a code base, with or without direct help from the maintainers?
Well, it's always preferable to have help from the maintainers. So go to conferences, go to sprints. Sit down with the maintainers. I love running those, and I love helping people like get started with that sort of stuff. And it's a lot easier in person than online, kind of asynchronous. But if I have to like jump into a code base, and this is true in my job and in open source, it's actually true even within the projects that I maintain. Because like I said, I didn't write them originally. I've been like the core maintainer for 5 years, but even in all that time, I still am not confident about immediately jumping into like the internals of the Jinja compiler and all that. And I just use a debugger. I use PyCharm and I say like, okay, well, here's how I just try to like trace the code paths. I say, okay, here's an example that reproduces the issue. Start stepping in. In PyCharm, also, sometimes you don't even need a debugger. You can just like control click on things and start following a chain of information. So I just start building kind of a visualization of how things are working by tracing the execution of the thing I'm interested in.
Awesome. A similar question that follows on from that is, how do you go about familiarizing yourself with a code base when contributing to a project for the first time? Which I imagine for a lot of the fellows right now, they've maybe never looked at the source code for any of the projects they're looking at. So they're looking for some advice on how they can help with their getting started with their projects.
Yeah. So I mean, I do have to do this. I maintain so many projects that I don't often contribute to other projects, but it occasionally happens. I'll notice something in something I'm using or something that's using one of our things sort of incorrectly, and I'll just say, oh, I have it's a little bit of time. Let's go over there and do that. So besides just like debugging, or like using a debugger, like I said, looking at tests is really helpful. So if you're like, how is this thing intended to work? The documentation is not clear. Well, hopefully it's tested at least. So if you can go find that thing being used in tests, you can see how it's actually being set up, because the test should reflect how it's expected to be used. Also, just kind of like ignoring some of the code base. Like a lot of the times, like I'm not going to become an expert in the project just to fix one issue. I'm just going to identify that one issue, follow the things related to it, and then make sure the test will pass. And then you can kind of broaden that over time.
I think that is a very key thing, is try not to get, even if it's like a massive project, try not to get overwhelmed by the whole thing. Just focus on the bit that you're trying to do. Take it in small steps.
Yeah.
So our next question is a little bit more fun. So someone asks, why is it called Ginger? I think that's how you pronounce it. Why is it not called Ninja?
I know there's a reason. I think it's in the docs somewhere that just talks about what the name is. I don't know why not Ninja. I think Ninja is a templating language based on Jinja for another programming language or something. So I think there is a Ninja out there. Let's see if I can find it. Oh, here, frequently asked questions. Why is it called Jinja? It's some sort of Japanese temple word associated with Japanese temples or something like that. Which is where the logo and the characters in the logo come from.
Well, if it's not in the frequently asked questions, I would recommend that people go and submit a pull request to add that to the documentation.
Yeah, I just linked it.
Oh, wonderful. Awesome. Cool. So our next question is a Flask specific question. How do you scale up a Flask project beyond a single file? What kind of features can help me do that?
Yeah, kind of the benefit, one of the cool parts about Flask is that you can just write your entire application in a single file, in just a couple lines. That's actually true of projects like Django also, except Django never advertises that fact. It advertises a big project layout to begin with. So people are used to seeing that, and that helps organize code. But it kind of obscures the fact that you can be just as concise in other frameworks too. So kind of using the same principles that other libraries use. If you look at the official tutorial, I rewrote it like 2 years ago now on the Flask docs. I actually don't, I show briefly, like, here is a one file application that says hello world. And then I immediately say, and while that's possible, I'm going to show you how to like lay out something in multiple modules so that you can kind of separate your concerns. So yeah, it's just kind of taking advantage of Python's capabilities to make packages and modules. Just kind of splitting up the different concerns. There's no required structure in Flask though.
Awesome. That's really helpful.
Let me see.
So our next question following on from that. So someone says, I see you're a core developer at Pallets. Does this mean that you're a full-time employee for them, or do you just devote some free time on a regular basis to help development of Pallet projects? You've kind of mentioned this already a little bit, but I wonder if you could go a little bit further.
Yeah, so Pallets is not a company. We are part of the PSF nonprofit. So we get kind of the benefits of being a nonprofit. We take donations, but and we can reimburse ourselves for like going to conferences and that sort of thing. But I just develop or maintain things in my free time, and I try to maintain a balance between doing that and hitting everything immediately and actually doing other things. So, which is hard sometimes. Yeah.
How do you like time manage that? Do you just like spend your time at the weekends working on it, or do you?
It really depends on how I'm feeling. So sometimes I'll I'll let PRs build up for a while and just knock them all out at once. And sometimes I'll just do a couple a day. Uh, when I about like 2.5 to 3 years ago, yeah, about 2.5 years ago, the projects had a lot more open issues, and it was really overwhelming, honestly. The more open issues and open PRs there are, the more you have to keep in your head about what things affect what, and like what things you want to group together into a release. And oh, if I merge this PR, it's going to break this PR. Wait, are these conflicting ideas? So starting a couple PyCons ago, to prepare for each sprints at the conferences, I started just every single day devoting like 1 hour to knocking out a couple issues. So we went from like 200 open issues in each of the projects down to Flask, Jinja, and Werkzeug have about like 30 to 40 on average now. Like, so the total is now around 80 or 90 compared to like the 600 there were before. But that takes a ton of time, and like just to knock out one of the projects took like 6 months, and then I was so exhausted after that I just kind of ignored. I moved on to the next thing.
That's really interesting. I imagine it can be quite hard to. Sometimes it just feels like it just never ends. I feel like you'll do a pull request and you'll just be more. The work will just never end.
Yeah, the only project like that still now is Click, but we've got a lot of MLH fellows knocking out issues there, so that'll be down soon enough. But it's so much easier to keep track of everything and to maintain things incrementally once you have your issue tracker under control. That it's helpful in the long run.
Have you got any advice for people on if they were to create a project, the best way to manage issues or so on?
I guess two things. One is have a very good, don't have an unchanging idea, but have a very good idea about what you want out of a project. You don't have to say yes to every feature request, even if it sounds useful. Because every time you say yes to a feature request, that expands the scope of things you have to maintain forever, expands the interactions between different things that could cause bugs. And if you've designed your library well, like I think Flask is, a lot of the things that people request don't have to actually be in Flask. They can either write those things in their project without too much hassle or make an extension. So yeah, knowing what you want, having the confidence to say no to things. And the other thing was, oh shoot. Well, that's pretty good on its own. What was say the question one more time, that'll jog my memory.
About best tips for like issue tracking on a project.
Oh yeah, and the other thing, this might not be true of like a small project because you probably want to foster more of a community directly when you're starting. But I have a canned response on GitHub that whenever somebody asks a question, I just have a canned response that says, this issue tracker is for issues about the code itself, not your use of the code. I say it a little differently than that. Like, go to Stack Overflow or our Discord to ask questions. And then I just close the issue. Because otherwise you kind of get into you become, not only are you debugging actual issues, but you're debugging everybody else's code too, which is just unmaintainable. And it causes a bunch of noise in the issue tracker too. So kind of having good places for different types of discussion.
Okay, that's really interesting. So following on, we have a few more questions. What are your top tips for new contributors to Pallets? So I imagine that was probably from one of the fellows working on Pallets over the summer. What are your top tips for them?
That's hard to answer. I guess I've recently cleaned up the contributing guides on all the and made sure they're consistent across all the projects. So we like go and follow the contributing guide. Make sure your environment is set up consistently so that you can run tests and reflect the latest changes. In terms of like the thing I get the most at like sprints that I run is what issue should I work on? And a lot of projects will have like a good first issue tag or something like that. We kind of have that, but I'm really inconsistent about applying it because it's really hard for me to judge like, well, yeah, this seems like I could knock this out in a couple of days, but I don't know if anybody else could or if it really is easy. So I don't apply it a lot. But what I've found is that it doesn't really matter if it's a good first issue. Like if somebody's sitting down at a sprint for a couple of days, with me or without or with like other maintainers, as long as they pick something that's interesting and that like has a somewhat clear goal, that people have knocked things out having never contributed to Flask before, for example. Like they don't need to start small necessarily. They just need to pick a thing and focus on it.
Okay, cool. Hopefully that's some helpful advice for some of you who are working on Pallets over the summer. So our next question is an open-ended question. Oh, that's exciting. How would you approach async web dev with Flask, or would you just not?
I have done very little async. I don't understand it well. There is a very popular extension called Flask Socket.io, which enables Socket.io is kind of a wrapper around WebSockets to give them a more powerful API. So that can enable async programming. There's always caveats to like how that works. Django has done a ton of work in the ASGI spec, which is asynchronous web server gateway interface. I've been talking to the maintainers about that and slowly figuring things out. There's a project called Court, which is a rewrite of Flask, but with async, but as async instead of sync. And the maintainer of that, Phil Jones, is one of the maintainers of Flask and Werkzeug now. So we're slowly kind of adapting all that into Flask as much as we can. I don't know if it will ever be fully async. But recently we had to, at work, we were doing a demo of this like kind of real-time like flight tracking thing on a map. And so we wanted to simulate the flights we were tracking. And so one of my developers wrote a kind of simulator in Trio, which is a Python async framework. And so we used Trio to write the real-time stuff. We used Flask to write the API that you would just use to edit information about the objects. And then we used Redis to communicate between the two. So we never actually did any async specifically with Flask. We just added another framework to do the thing we wanted to do. So yeah, there's a lot of options. The whole point of Flask is that like it's extensible. It doesn't require you to do any one thing.
Wonderful. Well, thank you very much. So now we've got a few questions that are more software development, a bit more general. So starting with that, we've got, what concepts do you think are fundamental and all programmers should know?
What concepts are fundamental and every programmer should know? Debugging. And I don't mean like using a debugger, but I think the most interesting book, I can't remember it off the top of my head, and it's in a bookshelf at my office, my work office right now, which I'm not at. But one of the most interesting books I read in college was like my freshman year of college. It was this like intro to computer science class, and where you didn't even do any programming, but they gave you this book, like 10 like principles of debugging or something like that. there's all these ways to like kind of like think about the code without necessarily writing the code, and how to like kind of structure like a model of the code in your head, how to diagnose problems, how to communicate your identification of a problem and your diagnosis of a problem. So yeah, I'd say I'll have to find the name of that book and link it. But
Or someone just put it in the Google Meet chat. Is this the book you were talking about? Debugging indispensable software hardware problems?
yes, that one. I recognize that.
Fellows are just too good.
Yeah, hey, it was 9, not 10 also, so I got it wrong. It's been a while. But yeah, that book was super good. And it's pretty short too. It's not like it's some like dry computer science book. So, yeah.
Cool. So, following on from that bit of advice, someone asks, what's the best piece of advice that you've ever received?
What's the best?
Yeah, these are quite open.
I don't know if I could like I don't know if I could keep track of like who has said what specific thing to me. But I think just in general, I follow a lot of other developers and like on Twitter, and kind of see the problems they're thinking about, how they're talking about things, not just in software, but adjacent to software or just in general. I follow like the PyCon organizers, what they're thinking about organizing a conference, and Django and all that, DjangoCon and all that sort of stuff. And so kind of getting perspectives other than my own on what problems people are dealing with, because there's a lot of problems that I don't see, but other people do see every day. I think that's really helped me and informed how I interact with my projects and the community, like supporting those projects. So I guess I would say I don't have any specific advice I can name, but I would say like follow lots of people who are in different spaces than you, or who are talking about different things than you, and listen to what they're saying.
Really interesting. Definitely keeping an open mind to these things is really helpful, because you may not even realize stuff in your own little space. So one of our last few questions asks, so you've already mentioned to people about processes they should do for debugging, but what's your process for getting unstuck when you're programming? Stack Overflow.
Well, the problem is I've never asked a question on Stack Overflow. I've only answered questions. I've got like 1,000 answers and 0 questions. So, and honestly, like as much as I like to tout my own answers on Stack Overflow, I don't find it that useful, because I don't know how trustworthy answers are a lot of the times. It's really so like I always trust the official documentation and stuff. I look for stuff that's been curated, like that people have clearly put a lot of thought into. So some sort of guide like that's organized and over multiple steps, or official documentation. In terms of getting unstuck from problems, a lot of the times I just set problems down. So I guess the biggest example I can think of, just because it for some reason it still sticks with me, but like the Werkzeug is like the lower level framework below Flask. It provides all these utilities for web applications, and it has a development server, and part of that development server is a reloader, so it'll detect changes in your code and restart the application, so those will be reflected. And that sounds really simple, but that is incredibly complicated. Like restarting a Python process is incredibly complicated, it turns out. Like detecting how the program was run in various different ways, detecting the arguments was run with, and recreating those correctly to create a new process. And so over time, there were various bugs that were reported about it, and the code was just incomprehensible for the most part. Like I knew in general what it was doing, but like it was very hard to follow, and I had to dive into it again every time something came up. So at one point, I decided like, okay, I'm just gonna like rewrite this detection function so I know what I want to detect eventually. I'm just gonna start from scratch and see if I can detect it. And that took a while. And I basically just a lot of the times sat down and said, okay, what is one problem I need to solve? And then I just thought about it for a couple of days. I didn't write any code. I worked on other things. And then eventually I came back, and I think this is true of like puzzle solving in general. You know, like if you get stuck on like some game or something like that, you know, if you come back a couple hours later, a couple days later, suddenly it seems easy, right? Yeah. So I think I just let my brain kind of stew on things.
Okay, cool. Well, our last question for this is, someone says that this is their first internship and they're definitely feeling a large sense of imposter syndrome, especially when reading through some of the insanely large code bases like Keras, Flask, and scikit-learn. How can someone doing their first internship start making large contributions?
Well, like I already mentioned, in sprints, you know, people who haven't been familiar with the code base at all have stepped in and made significant contributions just by, you know, just by working on it. You can do that. Everybody's capable of like picking a problem and following it down the road and solving it. And then, like I've also said, I still feel that those sorts of things. I still like jump into the code and go like, wait, how does this work? I thought I understood it, but like it's doing this thing now. Or, you know, like I've been maintaining things for 5 years now, and I still sometimes don't feel confident about making a call that changes something that was written before I started. I'm getting better at that, but it's just something. It's something that I think you work at. I think you need to. It's hard to do in the moment, but keep in mind that like you're as qualified as anybody else contributing to make those changes.
Awesome. Well, thank you so much, David. If anyone has any last few questions in these last couple minutes, do send them in the chat now, or unmute your microphone and you can ask the question yourself. I think you should be able to do that, but we'll just give it a few minutes. But I do want to just thank you, David, for spending the time to chat with us today. Really do appreciate it, and I'm sure that the fellows also had a really good time. Has anyone got any last questions or closing thoughts before we finish up? I know I definitely found this very insightful, and I'm sure everyone else did.